Now, Mike, you've been on another odyssey overseas to check out the left wing, uh, and at the moment, President Bush is having a lot of trouble with Latin America. They're getting pretty uppity. Mexico is on the brink of a sort of slightly left wing, or shall we say, a not neocon. And Venezuela, of course, is well gone down the track, and what's worse, they have oil. Chile voted in a woman who, is a social democrat at least. Bolivia has a new president who's threatening to nationalise oil and gas. Have I missed any out in Latin America?
Well, in many ways, I don't think they're happy with, particularly with Brazil and Argentina either. So,
Right, so we've got Brazil, and I mean the whole country's just it's turning away from the neocon. So this is quite something. And I was wondering, if you could perhaps update us about the latest developments there and implications for the global economy as a whole. First, perhaps we should start with Bolivia, with Venezuela, which is starting to, I believe, form some of its own, alliances, some sort of free trade agreements between people who genuinely believe in freedom.
I went on a trip to Venezuela with trade unionists from Australia to show a bit of solidarity to some of the developments that are happening there that the workers and trade union movement in Venezuela are part of, which is principally a process of social transformation in which workers are playing an increasing role in society. And I was able to participate in May Day in Venezuela, in which there was upwards of 1 million people flooded the streets of Caracas and proclaimed their desire for a new society, which they say is socialism in the 21st century. So the political language is changing in Latin America, the goals are changing, and these goals are being advanced principally by a new tripartite alliance of Venezuela, Cuba, and Bolivia. And they see themselves as something different. They see themselves as creating something different, a new society in which the rule of profit and the private corporation is not the dominant one, a society in which workers, peasants, indigenous people, women all play a full role and are able to control the resources and natural wealth that is part of their society. This is creating shockwaves across the Americas. The United States faced the defeat of openly right-wing governments in Brazil with the election of Lula as president, and in Argentina with Kirchner as president, and in Chile. But these governments were trying to reform their societies, and they weren't following the American model, and they were challenging them at World Trade Organization and so on. But they weren't challenging capitalism as such in their countries. They were trying to reform them, modernize them, play a more active role in world affairs, defend the national industries and so on, but they weren't trying to create some alternative model for the Americas. Bolivia and Venezuela are, and they've teamed up with Cuba to say that there is an alternative model, and an alternative model to capitalism, to neoliberalism, to the free trade zone, free market sort of policies internationally, and they're actively pursuing that within the tripartite alliance, if you like, but also reaching out to the other countries that aren't happy with the US domination of the Americas, like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, reaching out to these countries and saying, We will help you stand up to the Americans on some of these issues. We will form a regional economic alliance, and we will help you develop, help you deliver social programs. We won't demand that you destroy your indigenous industries. We won't demand you open up your sort of markets to the American soybeans. We will buy your soybeans. We will trade oil for soybeans. We will do what's necessary to allow you to develop. And if you're poorer, we will give you preference. We will give you additional help, which, such as a country like Bolivia, they have done that too. If you want to reassert your control of your natural resources, we will use our resources, like Venezuela's oil industry. We will help you in Bolivia develop your gas and oil industry. They've made the same offer to Paraguay. The principal policy, what is, I think, what is even different from that, is that the element of human solidarity, that the aid is first and foremost directed towards the people, is central to it. When Venezuela wanted to introduce free healthcare for its population, Venezuelan doctors wouldn't serve in the barrios and the poorest neighborhoods of Caracas, the slums of Caracas. Too dangerous, not enough money, whatever it was. So Cuba supplied Venezuela with 20,000 doctors, and they established clinics in all the poorest areas of Venezuela as the first line of healthcare. Then they built dozens and dozens of small hospitals, and now they were building major tertiary hospitals. It also allowed Chavez to deliver immediate benefits to the people who supported, to the poor people of Venezuela. He was elected 5 years ago, the first time round, and he confronted a situation where he didn't control the National Assembly, had to rewrite the Constitution, had to allow for a democratic process to develop. He had state bureaucracies that were opposed to him. He wasn't getting the revenue from the oil industry. All sorts of problems to try and assert democratic popular control over a state and an apparatus that was fundamentally built to do different purposes, not to serve the people, transform the army. All of those things he needed to do. And it made it difficult to delivering immediate benefits to the people. But through this alliance with Cuba, they were able to deliver these immediate benefits. Free healthcare, major impact on the population. He started to develop subsidized food programs. He was able to do a literacy program to teach the several million people who didn't have basic literacy, and he did that again with Cuban teachers. And as well as getting that immediate benefit, thousands of young Venezuelans have volunteered to learn to be doctors, to train to be doctors in training schools in Cuba, and ones being built in Venezuela. And now Venezuela and Cuba together are offering the same support to Bolivia. It's not just within those three countries. They are starting a program to cure functional blindness for 6 million people in the Americas, including some people from North America, but mostly, of course, South and Central America. 6 million people are going to be cured of functional blindness through a joint program of Cuba and Venezuela. They're just going to operate on them over the next 10 years. 600,000, an average of 600,000 people a year. And the impact of that on society, on basic communities, on the lives of families is huge. They think they have a debt to humanity. They are part of humanity. They have a debt to humanity. They will be part of the liberation of humanity. It fits in with their program of social transformation of the Americas as well, because these hundreds of thousands of young people who are going to be part of the training programs and community programs and all the rest of it they're developing are also going to be the bearers of a different worldview and a different moral outlook. And Che Guevara is coming back into his own as the symbol of this new socialist humanism that exists in the Americas.
That's brilliant. I mean, how could anyone oppose that? Well, of course we know that people will oppose that. So now I'd just like to go to socialism is been, you know, around now for 100 years. I mean, the first Russian Revolution, which failed, was in 1905, and so it's 101 years ago. People want to know that something works before they support it. They don't want to, you know, support something which then fails and takes them down as it goes down. Now, there was a coup in Venezuela against... Cuba has survived despite massive pressure, despite the collapse of the socialist support that it had and its sugar sales and etc. It has survived. However, it's by any stretch of the imagination, it's a pretty contained... It's a very high price that the Cubans are paying for socialism over there, whatever way you look at it. And Venezuela has oil, so it has a tremendous resource there, which it can use to support its programs and win supporters for what it's doing throughout, you know, the world. Because if you have oil, then you have friends, and of course enemies. My question, surely, I think this goes to the core, is that you know, Venezuela just survived that coup by the skin of its teeth. I mean, Chavez was taken away, and it was only that uprising, you know, spontaneous and unexpected uprising by tens of thousands of people in Caracas that you know, the right wing lost its cool, basically, and also his guard turned around. Anyway, I've shown the program on PTV before a couple of times, called the Revolution Will Not Be Televised, but the military thing is just so decisive to the whole history of any, you know, revolution or any dramatic social change, and especially to Latin America. How is the whole military scenario being dealt with within those countries? I mean, Bolivia, for heaven's sake, they've changed power so often and so frequently there, just on whatever general decides that they've had enough, you know, and they'll just you know, a couple of days of shooting in La Paz and whop, you know, the government's gone and another one's there. Blah. And Venezuela isn't exactly a paragon of stability either, with the military, you know, being purged. And we've seen the same thing in East Timor, where when the military get upset, or if even a few people within the military get upset, then suddenly the whole highly laudable, extremely pro-people, humanist project turns to mush in the face of, you know, military discontent. Fiji, similar. How is Latin America, particularly Venezuela and particularly Bolivia, going to continue this on, where these revolutions have failed so spectacularly and disastrously throughout Latin America in the past?
Each country is different. I think Venezuela is the most important at the moment, given the wealth gives them a certain leeway and a certain independence and ability to bypass the old state machinery. One of the fundamental problems with carrying out what could be called a democratic revolutionary process is that the old ruling classes never accept or get rid of democracy and abolish it as soon as the formal democracy doesn't serve their interests. So when a person like Chavez is elected president, and when parties associated with him sweep the National Assembly elections in Venezuela, the old ruling elites conspire to destroy those governments by using their institutional power that they've built up over decades. They did it in Chile in '73. They've done it in many countries in Latin America.
And they have tremendous allies in that process.
And they have their allies and sponsors and supporters in the United States government. Whatever Democratic or Republican hasn't mattered over the decades. Venezuela was different, and it was a factor in the failure of the coup against Chavez. for whatever reason, the Venezuelan government has never sent its soldiers, its officers, to the School of the Americas, which is the US-sponsored training program that most of the officer corps of Latin America learn their techniques, including methods of torture. And there have been manuals come out of the School of the Americas, based in the US, which train these officers with torture manuals to teach the officers the good techniques. Venezuela chose not to, for whatever reason, sent its budding officers to Venezuelan university in the 1970s. Chavez was one of those. They were deeply influenced by profound radicalization that occurred in the 70s. Venezuela had one of the deepest student radicalizations of Latin America. And there were many sort of socialist and communist and liberation and anarchist ideas, formulae, influenced a layer of these officers. There were also political groups who recognized that the Venezuelan military was going to be a factor in political life and allied themselves with these officers. These officers, in turn, they organized themselves into a group inside the Venezuelan military, coordinated their ideas, developed their programs for change, saw themselves as being part of the process of social change, a good and a strong influence. So the Venezuelan military was a little bit different. It still had lots of conservative right-wing officers who showed their hand in the coup in 2002. When that coup failed, because of the influence of a different type of officer competing for influence over the ranks, when that coup failed, they were able to retire, sack all of those generals and officers. Chavez has also tied the military concretely into the social programs. The military is part of redeveloping the communities, doing the roads, fixing up the neighborhoods. The military is part of delivering the food and social programs and so on to the population. The military is developing a new pride in itself as being an institution at the service of the people rather than an institution hostile to it. I'm sure there are still elements within the Venezuelan military who are hostile and post-process and may look for the opportunity. But the ranks of the military and most of the officers appear to be loyal to Chavez. And this is a product of decades, not something that's just relatively new. Chavez was an instructor at the military training school as well. Refused promotion for many years to remain an instructor to develop these links. He's intimately connected with all of the current officer corps in the Venezuelan military. And I met some of these people, and they were, when I was in Venezuela, I met a lieutenant colonel who was a private secretary with one of the Chavista governors in one of the states, and this man was a seriously radical socialist-minded person who was utterly determined that Venezuela was going to be transformed. And I don't know how, what his individual history was, but he was a lieutenant colonel. He was in the military, seconded to working with the governor in the situation. The governor, and it was typical of Venezuela, the governor had two private secretaries. One was from the trade union movement, one was from the military, and then there was another guy who was working in his office who was from the what's called the Bolivarian circles, which is the community organizations to organize millions of people in Venezuela to be part of the process.
Was that his choice, or was that foisted on him, this governor?
Oh, he's a Chavista. I mean, he chose his private secretaries. He's a loyal supporter of the revolutionary process, and they see it as the military, the workers, the government, the Bolivarian circles, more community based. They see this as an integral whole, and they were it was interesting just watching them discuss and debate about the future and the future as they saw it of socialism, the future of workers, deepening workers' participation and management of factories and of state, particularly beginning with the state economy, the state-owned economy, the oil industry, but also others, aluminium and the paper industry and some others. That the electricity, the workers were getting more deeply involved in direct day-to-day control, electing managers, and making this deepening the democratic aspect of Venezuelan revolution into the economy, which is a key part of that socialist transformation, and making economic life part of the democratic process as well. Another side to it in Venezuela is hundreds of thousands of people being organized into cooperatives, and we were able to visit some of these cooperatives, and they committed. They often get contracts through the state to do certain things, and they're trained as plumbers and carpenters, or more basic than that. It's more like a 6-month, 18-month courses, but they're able to do some of the basic infrastructure redevelopment, and these cooperatives share the money equally among themselves. They develop relations with the local community governments and so on.
Now, back in 1976, I spent 7 months in Latin America. And after that I spent 12 months in Moscow. So I sort of remember socialism and all that. Now this one sort of, with fondness, I mean socialism is great, and I want to get to that as to how it affects, if it has any implications for a country like New Zealand. But when I think about that, the implications that are being drawn, that Venezuela is becoming a centre of innovation for socialism, basically as a new answer, a revitalised answer to unquestioned materialism, capitalism as it's called, another word for it, or the global economy, whatever. When I look at Latin America, of course, back in the turn of the century, last century, it was all about workers and peasants against the bourgeoisie. And the middle class were automatically assigned the status of bourgeoisie. So you had a clear dividing line. You had workers and peasants, in Russia anyway, where there were, in fact, a lot more peasants than workers. They were meant to be, the big thing was to link those two and then unleash them against the minority, the extreme minority, who were royalty and or bourgeoisie, which was middle class if they were lucky. And even the middle class peasants were considered dire enemies of the budding socialist state, the kulaks as they were called. Now, over in Venezuela, we have a situation there where it's not so much peasants as sort of just straight out poor. And there are, in just about every capital city, in fact not just about, even in Buenos Aires, there are a substantial proportion of the population are dirt poor. They're not even workers, they're just survivors. That appears to have been mobilized within Venezuela. And when you put that together with the oil revenue and the peculiar situation that you appear to have described, where the military were peculiarly revolutionized by their experience within the university system and just the way that it turned out there, that you sort of just had that sort of critical class scenario. You had a critical class scenario where one class was coming up and through its links with military force, through Chavez, who was in the military and had intimate connections with it and still does, you had enough power, raw power, to actually affect a transition from one class to the other. Now that's a classic revolutionary situation. It might not be workers against the bourgeoisie, But it is a class transition, it appears to me, and I haven't thought of this before, just going by your description, that those substantial poor and underemployed have really taken something on here and found a supporter in the military, and now the income, just by, you know, the income is there now to support this and in fact spread this throughout the world. My question now is, okay, you've described why this would survive in Venezuela, and it does look like a very strong, survivable case for a dramatic change towards a socialization of the economy there. And barring Chavez going just absolutely, you know, sociopathic and turning into a Stalin or paranoid and setting up a whole secret police system which alienates him, barring him just going bonkers like that, which doesn't appear to be, although there are some signs of that, which I'd like to talk about, but it's certainly, he has intimate connections now and he doesn't survive on repression and etc. So it looks very strong there. What about Bolivia though? And then how can this be a centre of social alternatives when most people now, especially in Europe, New Zealand, Australia, even in certainly in the whole north of North America, and even in substantial parts of Latin America, would say they are middle class? So how does socialism work when you're not in Venezuela or Bolivia, and you don't have that power base, and you certainly don't have a revolutionary within the military? Are there any real implications for you and me, and you know, your average struggling worker slash small businessman, you know, within North America, Australia, New Zealand, Europe? I mean, really? Are there any real implications there?
Part of the key, that part of the development in the response to the coup was that the population mobilised in a way that it never had before to save their government. That he'd been elected president and things had started to change, but there wasn't that direct participation of the people in the process. That took time to develop as they won confidence and saw that they needed to protect something. So coming out of that, there has been an explosion in basic grassroots democracy, which is now being institutionalized with things called, with what they call community councils, which is every 400 families roughly, they have a citizens' assembly, they elect a local board, which is directly responsible to the assembly. It's able to get a budget from the state for priorities in their communities. What do they want to fix? Is it the rubbish collection? Do they want to take over a factory in their area? Do they want to develop some agriculture in their area? And they're able to form direct links with the state, control the finances themselves directly, and deliver their own solutions to their community problems. And they see this as the basis of a new democratic state structure, in which it is it's very much a direct democracy where the citizens participate directly at the most basic level and control the resources to do that. So this is a challenge for all of the existing state structures as well. You know, the traditional governments and the traditional parties as well. This is a completely new phenomenon in Venezuela, and it's an experience in direct democracy that could be revolutionary, because what they're doing will be revolutionary in Venezuela, but could be revolutionary for the world, because what they're doing in Venezuela is they try anything. They've got no blueprint, no model. When Chavez talks about socialism in the 21st century, he's not talking about socialism in the 19th century. But the social process that's unfolding there is true, has brought in people who had been driven out of the economy. That the years of neoliberalism in Latin America had destroyed traditional economies. They'd opened their markets to the Americans and the Europeans and so on. They'd destroyed their indigenous manufacturing. They destroyed a lot of their indigenous agriculture. They were relying on the export of oil, and the elite was just ripping off the oil wealth for its own purposes. They weren't concerned about the development of the country. The slums were growing in the big cities. But this population is looking towards the creation of a new society, and they're doing it in creative ways. And I mentioned the cooperatives as being one of those ways. That it's not massive. The program of development doesn't begin with massive sort of state economic sort of building factories and mines and so on. It's beginning actually with just involving the people in day-to-day economic life, fixing the housing, fixing the plumbing, fixing the delivering healthcare and so on. Education programs, land reform, giving farmers, giving landless people access to land. Bolivia, this is even more striking. Because the traditional industries have been destroyed. Mining, Bolivia has a great history of the miners' union leading revolts and being shot by the army, and it's sort of a glorious and tragic history. The mining industry was destroyed as part of this. The gas and oil are relatively recently discovered and still relatively underdeveloped aspects of the economy now, which is the new government has nationalised. People were driven out to coca farming. Miners became coca farmers, growing the raw material for the cocaine trade, but it's a traditional crop in Bolivia with a great cultural and social significance, and connected with deeply connected to their culture. So the American anti-coca crop growing programs, aerial spraying and sending the army in, was deeply unpopular. The new president was from a working class family, but had ended up as coca growers, and he had ended up the leader of one of these coca grower unions, and was the social struggle was this indigenous farmer, in a sense, this indigenous farmer and a farmers union, and they had many social struggles in Bolivia in recent years, but it wasn't led by the traditional unions and workers' movement. They had a water rebellion against the privatization of water. It was a community thing. They privatized the water, drove up charges. The community was dying. They've had massive struggles in La Paz, in the part of La Paz called El Alto, or the sort of the heights of around La Paz and the hills, where the very poor live, and pour into the streets each day, eking out a living, selling their goods, selling their products on the street. Tens of thousands of these people. But these people are organized into unions, into co-ops, very strong, very disciplined, who mobilize and have strikes and demonstrations. And so Bolivia, there was a growing social rebellion against everything that they had suffered, which had destroyed their society, destroyed their traditional industries, destroyed their livelihoods, in favour of imported products from the United States. So the election of Morales, who describes and his party, movement towards socialism, and Morales says he's looking towards a socialist transformation, but it's not a crude and simplistic thing like you were describing. There's many of the traditional attitudes to it, because the foundation in Bolivia, a foundation of the change. You're
saying I'm crude and simplistic.
You were repeating those crude and simplistic arguments
for that very reason.
Scenarios. But in Bolivia, the beginning of it is what they said is refounding their nation, based on the big majority indigenous population, of giving the indigenous people a means to maintain their livelihood through co-op. Fundamentally, they say they're going back to traditional Indian culture of cooperatives before the Spanish and the Americans and everybody else came and did what they did to them, which was to loot their country. Bolivia was a mine of, well, it was the gold center of the world, tin, gold, every sort of metal, and they just tore it out of Bolivia and left nothing for the people. The people just suffered and died in their hundreds of thousands in these mines, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, probably millions over the years through that, and left them with nothing. That's part of why the population was so angry when they discovered gas. After they discovered gas and oil, they got quite a lot of gas and a little bit of oil, and it was going to be sold off again, or it was sold off. That again, they were going to be left with nothing. And this new movement and social rebellion happened over a number of years, and this new government is backed up by a mass of social organisations with an ability to organise and mobilise. That's quite tremendous. That's again part of what the military hasn't always been reactionary in Bolivia either. They've had progressive military governments in Bolivia, and the indigenous character of this new social revolt, the majority of the army is actually indigenous. The old elite, Bolivia, like Venezuela in fact, that part of it was there was a tremendous racial divide that went alongside class and social divide. The elites were white, and the workers, the peasants, the barrio dwellers, they were brown and black. But the elites were white, often lily white. And even in a place like Bolivia, it was semi-apartheid actually. It was the social and racial divisions were so strong that the majority of the Indians, they were excluded from social and political life, economic life. They were treated as second-class citizens. And so this revolution is alongside the social revolution, alongside the change in class relations. So it's very mixed, and so in the process, new ways of doing things are being developed. The traditional norms aren't adequate for providing the type of answers that are needed for the continent. So when they say they're not doing a repeat of Cuba, that's true. They want socialism. They want a cooperative society. They want democratic roles in the economy, but they don't want to emulate what the Cubans did, because the Cubans came at a different time and developed it.
Now, back to once you have established a social change, and you've made some dramatic and real improvements to the health and well-being of people, then they start looking beyond, the next meal and the next cold spell, and they start their eyes, their ambitions. Naturally, our ambitions are endless, and we start looking at TV sets, and maybe I could set up a business of my own, and who could I trade with, and the whole sort of appeal of the middle class, which America basically said, look, here's a whole country, and we're all middle class. Everybody made it here. Everybody can make it to this area. Some get super rich, and but at least you'll be, comfortable. Have your own house, your own car, your own this, your own that, your own business. You'll have the middle class dream was sort of turning into a nightmare now, but that's the thing. But for those who are peasants and or poor workers, and especially if you are subject to racial discrimination, once you get beyond those, which has sparked revolutions in those two countries, what happens then? Because that's what's happened to Cuba. Then people want more. You see, and just across the Florida Straits there is something that it's just so hard to resist when, yes, you might have good health, but basically you're still eating rice 3 times a day, and you don't have a TV set, or if you do, it's 20 years old, and your car is a 1948 Chevy Via. I'm looking to the future, and then I'm going to ask you, okay, we are the future already here, and we have problems.
Okay.
How does socialism deal with those?
Okay. One is that a small part of the world is extremely wealthy and has monopolized that wealth largely for the past century or two. So you have North America, Europe, Japan, who
But even
any poor person in the world or would, coming from Mexico or Guatemala or Brazil or so on, a poor person in those countries, their chances are they would get a better life if they moved to a better life in material terms. Chances are, not guaranteed, but chances are you'd get a better life in material terms if you move to those things. And there's been a migration. Millions of people migrate around the world, as we do, from New Zealand to Australia for those purposes. So 10% of the New Zealand population lives in Australia. If the extremes are great, that is that you're in Mexico and you look across the border into the United States, then millions of people are drawn in that direction, and we've seen the consequences of that in the huge mobilizations in the United States recently to legalize these millions of so-called illegals living in the United States. That applies to countries like Cuba, as you say, that have made a revolution, and significant numbers of people leave Cuba for that life over in the United States.
But that's not an answer for most people.
It's not an answer. It's not an answer. Well, the America does this deliberately to Cuba. If you leave Cuba illegally and land in the United States, you get automatic citizenship rights. So this applies to no other country in the world. And the second factor is that they have a community of counter-revolutionary Cubans in the United States, who are the ones who left at the time of the Cuban Revolution. So that there was a family connections to some people. Despite that, the vast majority of people stay. Despite that, even the vast majority of their best sports people stay. Their baseball players come second.
But it's not easy to leave.
Well, it is if you're in a competition in North America, and some do. The Cuban baseball players get offered millions of dollars to play. The boxers get offered millions of dollars to play. A lot of the artists get offered millions of dollars to leave and stay overseas. Cubans can leave the Cubans are allowed to leave Cuba. You know, there is a program for, it's meant to be 30,000 visas a year that the United States is meant to make available for people in Cuba to go to the United States. The United States refuses to make those visas available readily. The Cubans have said that they'll recognize 30,000 visas, happy to do this. The US won't do it. They prefer the illegal immigration. But despite that, there are 20,000 doctors in Venezuela. They could leave. The tens of thousands of doctors in Africa. They could hop on a boat or a plane anywhere and fly to the United States, and they would get automatic citizenship. The vast majority of Cubans don't do that. They have their families, their lives, their culture. And for many of them, a different value system as well. That the value system...
I'd like to talk about that value system.
I went to Cuba once, and I was staying...
We need to address this.
All right, so once say, is it possible to have a new... No, because I think it applies to this question of what happens next. What happens next? Do you take pride in the fact that you can cure blindness for 6 million people in Latin America, that you are a doctor and you can do that, you can actually deliver that, you might be earning $100 a week? Or less, $50 a week. But you are part of a social, economic, political, cultural, medical thing in which you are going to make a difference to millions of people across that continent. Some of those doctors will say, no, I prefer to go to the United States and make $100,000 a year. Many of them say, no, I actually want to be part of this. There's several hundred doctors in Timor today. We don't actually hear, Cuban doctors. The Timorese government asked Cuba for assistance. Cuba said, fine, we'll send you a few hundred doctors. We'll train for free. They said to Timor, we'll train 1,000 young Timorese to become doctors, to deliver free healthcare to the Timorese. I don't know if that's going to happen now that we've had with the events there. But they're treating the people who are being wounded and or injured in Timor today. Most of the people are being treated by Cuban doctors. We don't hear about that. They sent doctors to Pakistan after the earthquake. 1,000. Treated hundreds of thousands of people. They sent people to Indonesia to do it. This is an ethical side to it, to these new societies. The Venezuelans are saying we want to emulate that. And I met people like that in Venezuela. They were training people who had professional people who were training these young the engineers and electricians and plumbers and so on. Some of them own small businesses. Some of them work for state corporations who, in their own time or by taking 3 months off, 6 months off, or so on, would be teaching these new cooperatives how to do the jobs that they're doing. They're doing it because they think they're making a difference in changing their society. They're not doing it for material benefit. They're doing it because they think this is a worthwhile thing to do. You can corrupt those ideals. You can buy off people. You can do all of those things, but will you succeed ultimately?
So this,
I think that, no, because I think that humans, that ethically we are superior to that. That what makes us human is not our avarice and our greed. I don't believe that. What makes us human is our ability to cooperate. That's how we became human. That's where we moved from being apes and so on. And even the best survivors in the animal kingdom, for those who are able to cooperate, we were able to develop through cooperation, through cooperative labor, through sharing of resources, through communal activity. That's what made us human. And I think that that's a more predominant trait in our human character. Capitalism is built on an ethical and moral system that matches the competitiveness of the economic model that capitalism is based on, and it was tremendously revolutionary and progressive in its day in economic development, but it's only been around 150, 200 years in a developed form. This type of economy where each business person competes against each other and it's a struggle and survival of the fittest, this economic system has only been in the earth for a few hundred years, and I don't think it's the defining character that it's the defining characteristic of us as humans. I don't think so.
That's true. It has only been around it's been around a bit longer than that in England, but double entry bookkeeping was invented in Florence, I think, in the 1500s. But
I said dominant.
Well, it was pretty dominant in Italy.
Yes.
The Pope.
It's been around.
The Pope's bankers cottoned onto this very quickly, and the Vatican was a very powerful force and continues to be so to this day. But getting back to this essential argument, which you've now raised, which I see is the answer to all of my questions, and that is the answer to all to all my questions is yes. If we just focus on the material, and if we believe that humanity is incapable of rising above that, then every socialist situation is doomed, because it is based on cooperation before competition. So you've raised exactly the point that this is, as much as it is a material situation, it is also a revolution of the spirit. And
that's what's needed.
Yes. Is that what you're saying? And of course this situation in the West, with all of its materials, a revolution of the spirit is exactly what people are crying out for.
I think it's also true that the wealthy capitalist countries have ceased to be able to deliver actually an improving standard of living for the majority of its population. I saw some figures, might have been in a magazine just last week, that for 104 every decade for 140 years, in the United States, real wages and living standards rose. So for 14 decades, without a stop, it rose. The last 3 decades in the United States, for the majority of the population, real wages have declined. The real standard of living for the majority of the population has declined 3 decades in a row, 30 years. For 140 years before that, it rose every decade. I think that's true in New Zealand, that for the big majority of the working population, real wages and condition of life, whatever form of TV you got, but real ability to survive and make a living has declined for most people, or it's much harder than it was in the 1970s. That the 80s, 90s, and now the thousands, that it's become more difficult, not easier for people to survive. That we might be able to buy some cheap Chinese imports at the warehouse or whatever it might be, but our ability to pay our power bill, feed our families, put a roof over our head, have a steady job with a steady income has become much more difficult. Now, I think that that's what capitalism's got to offer for the foreseeable future, to be honest. And particularly combined with that this economic model's usage of the natural resources of the planet, that this economic model is incompatible with those natural resources of the planet, whether it's global warming or oil depletion or the sea or the depletion of the sea or the exhaustion of the soil, and whatever it is, this system is treating our planet badly, and the planet will take its revenge on the societies that do that. So an alternative has to be found. I think an alternative has to be found, and it can't be based on the continued, can't be based on what capitalism is based on, which part of the reason of the destruction, the reason because capitalism has to turn everything into a commodity for sale.
Socialism isn't dead, is what you're saying. It's alive, and funnily enough, it's alive in Latin America, which people have written off as a basket case of the world, etc. And it's just because we don't have barrios pobres here, and we have quite a few people who don't have jobs and are underemployed and are poor, but nowhere near the numbers, and we don't have the class structure or the history of Latin America. That doesn't mean that there are some important implications. And one was that you said that socialism is saying that it isn't just about the material thing. That's the whole thing, that if you just focus on material wealth, which I would say there was one of the massive mistakes that they made in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev banging, saying on the UN desk with his shoes, saying we'll overtake America. Give us 2 5-year plans, and we'll overtake America. I mean, as if that was socialism, that it could deliver more TVs and cars and tractors than capitalism could. Well, what rubbish! So that was one lesson that they've certainly learned in Latin America, and Cuba as well. It's doctoring the world in a very different way by sending out doctors to everybody. And that's, as you pointed out, a completely different ethos and way of life and reason for living. And that's a very important thing that they appear to have learned the hard way in Latin America, which we are now learning here, because the second thing was that capitalism's material impetus, the very thing that it did deliver, it can no longer deliver. And it certainly can't deliver it to millions of Chinese, and it is even failing to deliver it to its own people, and it's killing them in trying to defend its position. So it's just going to eat them up now. So now, if I'm not wrong, you can correct me in a second. You've come back from Latin America reinvigorated in your view that this is a genuine socialist change going on there, and that there are implications also for all people throughout the world. This isn't a specific Latin American model, and in fact one of the lessons was that you shouldn't have a model that you can't spray socialism on, that you've got to treat it like the Greens treat growing food, good food, and that is that you let the soil specificity develop in its own way, and you allow natural fertilizer and you follow it through in its own organic process. And now I have to ask, if difficult, but can you see any organic growth of socialism, say, within New Zealand? And if so, what are the forms that appear to be naturally arising within, say, the New Zealand situation?
Like you, Alan, I became a socialist at a young age, and so for the last 30 odd years I've retained a belief in the socialist ideal, because nothing that capitalism seemed to have to offer in the last 30 years in the world or in New Zealand, nothing it was delivering seemed superior. We saw the destruction of the governments from 1984 through to neoliberal governments, economic restructuring, the market, the free market, imports replacing domestic production, jobs being going down, real wages declining, delivery of healthcare getting poorer, delivery of education services getting more haphazard and poorer. Nothing capitalism had to offer, but socialism seemed also a very elusive thing, that it had gone off the agenda as a political alternative. So the best we could do, there was a nice ideal, and let's struggle as best we can around issues and concerns. Let's try and change our bit in society here. Let's do what we can, reform this, reform that if we can. But as a project, it seemed that with broad sweep and vision and an ability to inspire and motivate new generations, that seemed difficult to come back. Couple of things make me more optimistic today. One is obviously what I saw in Latin America, that this idea of an indigenous socialism, a creative socialism, a democratic socialism, a popular socialism is becoming a real alternative in an important part of the globe, and it's helping, I think, revive and revitalize even some of the one revolution that did survive, the Cuban Revolution. And they are doing an enormously creative thing, not just in the medical and educational field, but in the field of agriculture. They've transformed Cuban agriculture to an organic basis. It's one of the leading organic. They abandoned the old sort of industrial fertilizer model and are looking at how to conserve the resources of their soil and their land, and they're talking about this in a global way as well. That's an aside. In New Zealand, I think that we're seeing the exhaustion of the schematic thinking that dominated the left from the 70s into the 1980s. Schemas and divisions based on half a century ago. They are disappearing. People are approaching the left politics in an open mind, but they're beginning to look at the left and socialist alternative again, or anarchist ideas, or whatever ideas they are. Don't really care. They're looking at ideas again as an alternative to what we have, because there is deep disappointment. We were promised a better life. We were that if we let the Roger Douglases and Ruth Richardson and if we let them do to us what they wanted to do, that eventually everything would be better. I work for a union that represents mostly people on the minimum wage who have almost no rights, completely casualised, and don't know what hours they're working from one week to the next. And some of the most profitable companies in New Zealand can talk to us across the bargaining table and say there's nothing wrong with us not being able to say to a part-time worker whether they work 4 hours one week or 40 hours the next week. What's wrong with that? They should, if they want to work here, you know, the argument, rubbish.
Yeah.
That if this is the best they've got to offer after all their changes, then people are going to say, enough of that, we've got to look for some alternatives. Now, and if wars are all they've got to offer to preserve control over the world's resources, if environmental destruction is all we've got to look forward to, if all of these things is all we've got to look forward with the existing system, then an alternative becomes a necessity.
But there's one thing you missed out.
Not just a possibility.
Yeah, a necessity. One thing you missed out, and that is you can address someone who has got a job, who has got this, who has got TVs, who has got cars, may have it all, but somehow they haven't got it. Even they haven't got it these days. That spiritual, soulful gap.
Yes,
So
yes.
this is the point I raised there. That is also something that I think has raised its head more than ever. It's not just the material thing that you pointed out now. It is a lot more than that.
People were also told that if they got these things, and it includes middle class people, you see,
Yes.
if you got it, you would be happy. If you and some people did make it. Some people did get more. They got there.
Quite a few.
Yeah. Some people did better out of this. You know, a third of the population or a quarter of the population did very well over some of those changes. 3/4 didn't. But the quarter who did very well, even they recognise, I think, that what they got is not fulfilling. Is not fulfilling. The awful statistics on suicide among young people that we have in New Zealand, the awful statistics associated with child abuse, the awful statistics associated with
alcoholism,
and drugs, and all the rest of the crap that we have. There is a spiritual despair because there appears to be no purpose. Because it's true, the acquisition of material goods will never satisfy people. They've even done scientific studies on it. That people that actually sort of wealthier people are more unhappy in many ways than poorer people. That the material wealth doesn't. So
for all those reasons,
yes, we will. I think see a re-energization. There's a world movement going on. Hasn't been reflected so strongly in New Zealand around what's called the World Social Forums. The slogan "Another world is possible," that has involved hundreds of thousands of people across the globe in a political way. They're looking for political alternatives, social alternatives, economic alternatives. Broadly, they are left. Broadly, they are socialist. I think that will, this is where I think the importance of Venezuela and so on, that under the impetus of genuine social transformation, that this will coalesce into a stronger international movement, which more explicitly poses a socialist alternative.